we have at the moment is, as all of us parents know, the state of education. How to ensure that children are properly educated and that a core principle of liberalism, the equality of opportunity, is safeguarded. So the question, how do we go on with education? What learnings have we had? How can we ensure that young people can make the most of their lives with a proper education? How do we make sure that nobody gets left behind? These are some of the questions that we might talk today. I have the great privilege and pleasure to introduce to you Isabel Parasram, who is not only the Vice President of the UK Liberal Democrats and a federal board member, but she's also, and that's for us as European Liberal Forum more important, the trustee of our member, the Paddy Ashdown Forum, a think tank based in the UK, closely connected to the UK Liberal Democrats. Important to say about Isabel as well is that she is head of the Barristers Chamber and works internationally in that regard. So I think there's no one better to host this session here today than you, Isabel. Thank you so much for being with us, and I can only give you the floor right now.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Well, bonjour, guten tag, hola, bienvenue, hola. My name's Isabel Parasram, and I am Vice President of the Liberal Democrats, as Daniel has just said. And I'm really honoured to have been invited here today to moderate the fifth in our series run by the European Liberal Forum, and the series is called Liberties in Lockdown. And today we're going to be discussing a hugely important topic for all of those who are passionate about education, and for the many parents and carers at home who are now taking over the jobs of our very well-respected teachers and really understanding how professional and difficult their job actually is. And we're going to be discussing that with three fantastic speakers today. Just wanted to alert everyone to the fact that today's session is going to be recorded and it's currently being live streamed on Facebook. So if you want to alert your friends, colleagues to that fact, that would be fantastic. I'm aware that we've got quite a few participants already. And if you want to engage in the seminar, then please do put your questions in the Q&A box. There's a small button at the bottom of your screen where you can start asking questions. So please feel free to do that. There is a possibility that rather than reading the questions out loud, I may invite you to read your question or potentially comment. So do be prepared for that. And if you could indicate whether you would like to speak, that would be brilliant, and then I can make a decision as we go on. So just to give you an idea of where we're going with this webinar, we have three speakers, each of whom will speak for a short while, and then I will follow their speech with a question if there is time to do that. After all three speakers have had the chance to say what they have to say on this particular topic, we will then open the floor for the Q&A debate. And we're aiming to be ending so that you can get back to work or whatever you've been doing or are doing at 10:30 UK time, which will be, it will be 10:30 in your time actually, and 9:30 in my time. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. His name is Andreas Schleicher, and he is the director of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And I'm really looking forward to some of the things that he's got to say. So the floor is yours, Andreas.
Thanks so much, Isabel. And one of the first things that we could see almost consistently across the world is the shutdown of schools in response to the COVID crisis. Obviously, school closures help to spread the virus. But actually, if you look at the relative impact, it's actually quite modest compared to what we can achieve to community contact reduction, household quarantine, or workplace social distancing. And one day we're going to count up, what have been the social costs of school closures to families, to individuals, to societies, versus the relative benefits. Obviously, I should say this more nuanced. When I look at Europe, for example, in the case of Italy, on the horizontal axis, you see the age of students, on the vertical axis, the age of their contacts at home. And in the case of Italy, The smallest children, 0 to 10-year-olds, have a lot of contact with the over 60-year-olds, their grandparents. So they're obviously, in the case of Italy, you know, school closures have a rationale, kindergarten and so on. If you look to Belgium or Finland or other countries, actually the contacts between the youngest and the oldest are quite limited. So there you can call more into question those kinds of measures. But you know, that's another story, that's another debate, the benefits of school closures. What I want to talk today is about the impact that it has on education. Basically, it's affecting 1.5 billion students. At the height of the crisis, it was 1.7 billion. Remote learning that used to be a nice to have is now the lifeline for education. Basically, we have compulsory, mandatory homeschooling for people. For some young people, this is liberating and exciting. Those who have the right parental support, those who have the motivation and the learning strategies, who've learned to study on their own. But for others, this is a huge, huge challenge. Now, students do not have access to the right technologies. Students who do not have the family environment that is supportive for that kind of learning, not contact with their teachers. And often, if you used to be spoon-fed by your teacher with little chunks of knowledge, now learning on your own is just an amazing challenge. Now, access, use, and quality of online resources are basically amplifying the many inequalities that we had already before the crisis. So this is a magnifying glass that actually has, put those at an advantage, at a further advantage, and many others behind. Accreditation is at stake. Young people may be happy that there's no exam this year, but this is a generation that will be stigmatized. Basically, if you do not have a credible kind of way of showing what you can do, particularly young people going to vocational education and training, workplace learning, internships, all of this is much harder. There's just a huge need for just-in-time professional development. Obviously, teachers are confronted with challenges they could not have possibly been prepared for, and sort of getting up to speed with this poses huge challenges for system. One of the things that don't get so much discussed is how should we reprioritize what students learn. Basically, when you have only like 30–40% of effective instruction time, are you going to focus on the very fundamentals that give students the knowledge and skills they need to pass the exam, math and science and reading, or are you realizing that actually this crisis commands a much wider range of social emotional skills and the importance of student well-being? You're going to put your focus on this. These are very, very difficult choices that confront most education systems. Now, there are many challenges. The one thing I also want to say, there are lots of really innovative learning environments emerging. Now that our kind of bureaucratic school structures have sort of become fractured, actually there's been lots of really, really productive initiative at the grassroots level to actually help overcome some of the challenges. Now, let me just conclude with showing a few pieces of data on this. Basically, here you can see online learning at home starts with a quiet place to study. Now, that's so obvious. And you can see in some countries on the left side, it's taken for granted. You look to the Netherlands and so on. Everybody, every young person, every 15-year-old has a place to study. But you look to other countries here. Now, basically Bulgaria, you talk about 4 out of 5. And what you also see is that the orange triangle, those who come from disadvantage, is much lower than those who come from more privileged backgrounds. You can see even the conditions at home amplify social disparity. The same is true when it comes to, you have access to a computer for schoolwork. Yes, in Denmark, Slovenia, Norway, Poland, you can take that for granted. But then you look at the other side of the screen and you can see in Turkey, we are talking about 2/3 of young people. And again, huge social disparities in basic access to technology. And this is sort of the fundamental. I come to the much tougher challenges. Now we ask school leaders, do your teachers have the necessary technical and pedagogical skills to actually integrate digital devices in instruction? This is so important these days. Online learning is not just consuming internet content. It's really about structuring in pedagogically meaningful ways learning experiences, particularly if we want to reach students from disadvantage. And there you can see the real challenges. Now again, you look on the left side, parts of China and so on, doing really well, Singapore and so on. But if you look to many European countries, look to Spain here, look to Italy, even Finland, Ireland, you are talking about 50% of principals who think that teachers are up to speed with those kinds of requirements. And again, big social gaps in most of these cases. Now, so the challenge is not so much technological, but much more a one of human capacity, human resources in this. If you go a little bit further, you know, obviously for this kind of learning, you need good online learning support platforms. Once again, in some countries on the left side, you know, Singapore, China, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and so on, those are quite well developed. But you look to Kosovo in Europe, you look to Belarus and Romania, and so on. There you can see actually it's just a minority of young people who have access to online learning platforms. There are amazing solutions that exist, but we have not yet been very good to scale and spread and share them. That's probably something, you know, this crisis really highlights, that education generally is quite far behind the curve when it comes to the effective deployment of technology. But let's not forget, you know, learning is not just a transactional experience. You know, MOOCs have never been that successful. Learning is always a relational experience. You know, the teacher you remember from your days most, and the subjects that you like most probably had less to do with the discipline and more to do with who taught you, the kind of person in front of you. And again, in this moment of crisis, the capacity of teachers to do more than just teaching, to relate to individual students, to understand that different students learn differently, and engage with that diversity, to become, you know, as a teacher, not just a good instructor, but also a good coach, a good mentor, a good facilitator, a good evaluator. Those are the real qualities that now matter. And I must say, in peace times, we have probably not invested enough in those kinds of qualities, and often created quite tailoristic work environments where we ask teachers to teach in front of the classroom and then delegate other functions to other people. And that is now hurting. Now, basically, you can see education systems where teachers have more holistic ways of structuring their working day, are better positioned and are doing a better job in this crisis. Let me just conclude with one slide that basically just shows you beyond this crisis. This is actually data from 2018. You can see that teaching and learning is doing quite well when it comes to very traditional, you know, ways of teaching, clarity of instruction, classroom management. But when it comes to sort of giving tasks that require students to think critically, now you're talking about, you know, a little bit more than half of the students who experience those kinds of learning environments. And what could be more important in this digital age than your capacity to navigate ambiguity, to manage learning on your own, to think critically? So we take it for granted, but even among 15-year-old students, that is less common than you think. Having students work in small groups to come up with a solution. Everybody talks about social skills these days. Now that's something that employers tell you first. It's not something very common in our learning environments yet. No? We talk about social skills. Now everybody is talking about this, but then we put students behind individual desks. And at the end of the school year, we test whether they are better than their neighbor. So there's again a big reality gap. Letting students to solve complex tasks, the complex problem solving, is actually still quite rare. Or, you know, giving students projects that require at least 1 week to complete. That's now, you know, almost the only way how you can learn in this crisis, where students are at home on their own. And you can see in peace times, it's on average across the OECD countries, only the case in less than 30%. And then, you know, again, letting students use technology for projects or classrooms. Half of the students have those experiences on a regular basis. The other half is left out. So I think what this data highlight really is there are massive challenges in front of you. We should, you know, school closures may have made some contribution to contain the spread of the virus, but clearly they have had a big kind of amplifying factor on the quality of education and also on the kind of social disparities. Now, when students are going to come back, you know, teachers are going to find a very, very different world. Thank you very much. I'll leave it here.
Thank you, Andreas. That was absolutely fascinating. And the information that you've provided is incredibly rich. I have so many questions that I want to ask you, but I'm going to try to limit myself to one. You mentioned that perhaps now is a time to look at what we teach in school and effectively the purpose of education. And as a parent of 4 school-aged children myself across the board from primary school into secondary school, what I've realized during this lockdown is that the subjects that were not so much of a focus before, like art, music, drama, are now becoming key to what we do as parents. You know, it's the kind of thing that we're all swapping on WhatsApp and giving ideas of what to do in terms of not only entertaining the children, but giving them context for their learning. And I'm just interested in finding out what you think would be potential changes that we could make to the curriculum and the way that we teach going forward as a result of this crisis.
Yes, Isabella, I think this is one of the most crucial questions that we should ask ourselves, not just in this moment of crisis, but more generally. What we know is that the kind of things that are easy to teach and easy to test are precisely the kind of things that nowadays are also easy to digitize, to automate, to outsource. You know, the world no longer rewards you just for what you know. Now, Google knows everything. The world rewards you for what you can do with what you know. And we give that much too little importance. Creative skills, your capacity to imagine, to build something new, your capacity to navigate ambiguity, to manage complexity, to resolve tensions and dilemmas, your capacity to take responsibility, to mobilize your cognitive, social, and emotional resources to actually do something, to take action. I mean, those things are really coming to the forefront. And you know, arts is a great way to enhance many of those kinds of capabilities, but so could be mathematics. You know, I think actually it's less a question of the subject, it's more a question of what we teach in those subjects. You know, my field is science. We teach young people a lot of biology and chemistry, very superficial content knowledge that may be outdated when they graduate. We don't teach them how to think like a scientist. Can you design an experiment? You know, can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? You know, we wish we would be a lot better now in this moment of crisis to deal with science, the ideas of science, or the ideas of history. You know, history is not about names and places and people. History is about, can you think like an historian? Can you understand how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it developed, how it advances, and sometimes how it unravels when the context changes? So I think, you know, this crisis really highlights that we fundamentally need to rethink what students should learn and maybe teach fewer things at much greater depth.
Absolutely, Andreas. I could listen to you all day, but I will pause and move on now to Thomas Clausen, and he is policy advisor at the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. And he is particularly interested in digital education and innovation. There's lots more I could say about Thomas, but look at his bio, it's absolutely fascinating. So I'll hand over to you, Thomas.
Good morning, thank you for having me. And of course, many thanks to you, Andreas, for a fascinating presentation. I want to start off by emphasizing something that's very obvious, and that is that it is a very difficult situation indeed. So it is a situation where we definitely need to navigate ambiguity, as Andreas has said. And it's also quite a frightening situation in which we worry about the health of ourselves, of our loved ones, and very likely also our economic existence. And it's very important to be open about the fact that there are no easy solutions and that there is no innocuous path forward, especially when it comes to dealing with pupils' protests or so. We need to take them seriously, but we need to also emphasize the importance of continuing education. One of the particular problems is the fact that there is a conflict between two very basic rights, the right to health and the right to education. And these difficulties are exacerbated by our limited knowledge about the virus, and in particular, our limited knowledge about the way it spreads. For example, in Germany at the moment, there's an ongoing debate between leading virologists about the infectiousness of children. And these disagreements are part and parcel of scientific research, but it makes it very difficult for those who have to rely on scientific expertise to make definite decisions. And it is also a reminder that scientific advice should inform policymaking, but that it cannot replace it. The right to education is currently on lockdown, and the key issue for us today is how we can restore this particular liberty and this very important liberty. As we have already seen, there are different approaches, even amongst European countries. As for now, for instance, there are no final exams in the UK and in Italy, but there's a gradual opening of schools in Germany and Denmark. One of the reasons is that there are regional differences and also regional threat levels. But of course, another reason is that we simply do not know for certain what the best path is. What does seem clear, however, is that education, research, and especially schooling will not be the same for the foreseeable future. Experts tell us it will take at least a year before a vaccine is readily available, and for as long as it is not, we have to be very careful. On the other hand, it also seems to be clear that we cannot simply ignore the right to education and leave everyone at home. The main reason is not, as some of our critics allege, economic, although this is, of course, a very good moment to emphasize that the functioning economy that supports a good and expensive healthcare system is also saving lives, and that the economy does rely on parents being able to leave their children at home, at school. But there are, of course, two different reasons that are much more important for us. One is, as I've mentioned before, the right to education, or as Lord Dahrendorf said, education as a civil right. And this right is especially important for those children who come from disadvantaged backgrounds and who are not able to learn efficiently at home. And we've heard a lot about this already. And perhaps because their parents cannot help them, because they don't have access to a device or the internet, or because there simply is no quiet space for them at home. What is clear already is that the educational gap is widening, and this should really worry us. But it's not only the right to education that is being infringed, but also the right to health. Some children rely on school being a safe space, and everyone needs school not simply for imbibing knowledge, but for his or her personal development. Children need social contact or their development will be stunted. And there's a significant health risk, and this is a significant health risk that we should consider as well. And while we are primarily concerned about children, we should also be concerned about parents and their health, who have to accomplish an enormous task day to day, and who are, a lot of parents are already at the limits. So what are our solutions? Now, I think the key concept is some kind of hybrid school. We have to combine distance learning with school attendance. And of course, when it comes to reopening the school, safety comes first. But that means, for example, that at least at the beginning, there needs to be some sort of shift system that's already being implemented in a lot of schools, where some pupils stay at home and others learn in the classroom. And at the same time, we need to really rethink about what pedagogical concepts we can use. For example, the flipped classroom, where pupils can prepare certain sort of the knowledge side of things at home and then get the relational personal development side at school, and also where the teacher can fortify what they have learned with digital tools at home. And then we need, of course, a true push for digitization, where we need to make sure that every teacher and every pupil has access to the relevant resources. There are a lot of open questions. For instance, what kind of video conference software do you use? And you have to keep in mind, this is not as easy for schools as it is for us maybe, because they need to keep in mind data protection. They need to be, someone needs to be held responsible if the videos of the children happen to end up on some sort of foreign server. And so it's not as easy for them to simply start using a video conference software, but we need some rules. And of course, they need the resources and the money to acquire them for the schools. And you have to keep in mind that 5 to 10% of students of certain age groups, depending on, of course, the country and the age group, but for example, in France, this was already a huge problem. It's the same in Germany, that 5 to 10% of the students don't even have access to a smartphone. So you can't even take this for granted, but you should be thinking about concepts such as bring your own device when it comes to introducing video conferencing software. So if they work on a smartphone, that's good. But above all, we really need a change, especially when it comes to digital tools, and it really needs to happen very quickly now. So this as a start.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And I'd just like to remind participants that you can feed your questions into the Q&A box if you're currently live with us on Zoom. And also please do send your questions in by Facebook. I do have some questions in advance. So please do use our speakers, because they're absolute experts in their field, as you've just heard from Thomas. I would like to ask you one question, and that is, I got the sense of safety when I was listening to what you had to say. And I know that this morning there was a report on a charity that deals with the children of alcoholics here in the UK. And they have said that calls to their helplines have doubled. and also dropped calls where children call up and then they put the phone down suddenly. And you talked about schools being a safe space. I'm just interested in finding out more about the concept of school being a safe space and the balance here with children being at home and potentially exposed to danger, and the provision that schools provide in terms of giving children a break from what may be happening at home.
So the basic idea of school being a safe space is that schools can act as a sort of watchdog, so they can see if a child comes to school, whether there's something wrong. They can then consult youth services and other institutions, and there's no way to make sure that children are fine when they are simply at home. So some schools don't even have contact to some of the pupils. And at the same time, and we can already see this from the first police statistics that come in, there's an increase in domestic violence due to the lockdown because, first of all, everyone is locked at home. This is a physical and above all a mental challenge. And this also puts children at risk who might be very difficult to teach. And it's also very difficult for them to be in their own four walls all the time. And some parents are not able to cope for them, and that can be very dangerous for children. So schools really serve as a safety valve, and we already know also that even in normal times, there are hundreds of thousands of children at risk. So there's, I think, one statistic was that there are 100,000 investigations into child safety every year in Germany alone. And this is, of course, not every investigation is concluded in a way that means the child has been harmed, and some children are investigated several times a year, so we need to be careful about those statistics. But this is a huge issue when it comes to schools being now closed, because basically there's no neutral body that can also represent the interests of the child when it's now left alone.
Thank you so much for that, Thomas, and we'll be coming back to you during the Q&A, so brilliant. And I'd like to thank those people who have submitted questions. I'm just reading through them, and I may ask some of you to speak, so be ready for that. I'm going to hand over now to Susan Dallinga, and she is a researcher at the Mr. Hans van Mierlo Foundation, and she has recently published an article on inequality and the disadvantages for certain children during this lockdown. So Suzanne, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, thank you so much, Isabel. And thank you, Thomas and Andreas, for your contributions to this discussion. As Thomas already mentioned, one aspect of the more level of values, namely the right to education, I'd like to add something to that as a starter. Because I think it's very important to point out the concept of equality of opportunities that we are talking about today. But it's also a very difficult concept, I guess. First of all, a lot of people would agree to this concept because it sounds good, and we assume that we have something like that because we have a free and equal society. But when it comes to the question, to what extent you are allowed as a government to intervene to actually guarantee equality of opportunities, there are a lot of different options that you can choose. So I think that is something to keep in mind. I totally agree, however, on the assumption that equality of opportunities is basically the most important principle in education to aim for, at least in a progressive liberal society. I think, at least in the Dutch society, which I know the best, 100 years ago, it really mattered whether you were born as, for example, a woman or a man, and whether you were born from a poor family or a rich one. It really did matter for your chances and for the equality of opportunities. So you did not have the chance to receive the same amount of education as a woman or as a child from a poor family compared to men and people born from a rich family. We know that. Nowadays, we live in a meritocracy where supposedly only talent and merits counts for your chances. I say supposedly because it's not completely true, I guess. There is a new kind of inequality of opportunities right now. Because now it matters whether your parents are, for example, highly educated or not. In, for example, the Dutch society, research shows that children with similar results at school get different school advices given in our society at the age of 12, dependent on the level of education of their parents. And on top of that, highly educated parents take more effort to improve their children's school results, for example, by using summer schools, homework institutes, and by showing them extracurricular activities. And now I get to the point where the virus comes in, because we all had this situation somewhere during the month of March where the schools closed because of the lockdown that we were facing. And children faced a period of online education. And the amazing thing was, within a week, every school and every university managed to set up some kinds of education online, which normally would have taken, I guess, at least 5 years. I would say that is a great achievement. But after a couple of weeks, I think you could already see what the problems were. And I'm not talking about the complaints like some of my colleagues expressed on how difficult it was to combine their work with homeschooling their kids. I'm really talking now about the children who did not have a laptop or a quiet place to study, a stable home situation, or help from their parents. So once again, the division in our society became very clear. Now more than ever, I would say. Because even though there were good private initiatives or school initiatives to provide children with laptops, and even though many children did their absolute best and managed to keep up anyway, even though they may not have had the best home situation, you can already tell that children from highly educated, stable and well-done families make a major jump right now, while children who do not have those facilities will at least temporarily fall behind. So I would say, what are the lessons that we are facing right now? The first one, online education can be a great addition, but teachers need to be facilitated and educated in this because it's really a different skill, as Andreas already mentioned. Second one, online education lacks social aspects right now. Teachers can barely see how students are really doing at home, and children cannot play with their classmates, which is a big miss for their development, because children also learn from each other just by being and playing with each other. And as Thomas already mentioned, with some students at home, teachers cannot even get into contact. Thousands of students in the Netherlands are missing. Thirdly, I would say that online education has once again showed the inequalities slumbering in our society, a division that starts already amongst our youngest ones. And I hope this will be a wake-up call for all of us. We need to think about how much we want this equality of opportunities. Because when we really want this, we need to realize that equality of opportunities sometimes requires an unequal treatment. It sounds strange, but it is true. You have to do more for the ones that have less chances by default, because it still matters from what family you're born.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. You've highlighted some of the major concerns very succinctly, and we're very appreciative of that. I just wanted to ask you more about what you see as the solutions to the inequality that we see, and what changes we can make going forward that are going to be practical and affordable. Or do you think that money just shouldn't be on the agenda with this?
Yes, well, we do need a lot of investments in education, I guess. I would say it really depends whether you would send children to school again right now or not. For example, yesterday I read that in Spain, for example, schools will only open on the 1st of September or the 1st of October. That's a big difference with, for example, with the Netherlands, where schools are opening next week, at least for the children from 4 to 12. If you have the opportunity to start again school education in the physical situation, I think the best way, even if you can only have like half of the children at school, the best thing is to start at least with the children who need the education the most, the physical education the most, and to invest more in the children who are laying behind right now. I think that is the most important thing. And even if you do need to provide them online education for the next couple of months, I would say there are also options to invest more in the children who need it more. Maybe with some extra hours a week. Even if it's online, it's just the best thing you can do. Teachers can, for example, take small groups of students and provide them with some extra support for their homework. Even if it's just 2 hours a week, I think it's the least we can do. And I totally agree with the point that Thomas made about hybrid education. If this is something that we need to do for the next couple of months, maybe even for a year, then we should also invest in hybrid education and make sure that it is done in the best way possible.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Suzanne. I'm going to move on now to the debate. And we've probably got time for 2 or 3 questions, I suspect, if we really want to cover them well. So if Martin could be ready and available, he submitted a comment, really. So Martin, I'm hoping to ask you live if you're agreeable to that. I'm raising this particular question because, Suzanne, you've just talked about homework, and it's interesting because I'm quite involved in education, as you know, as a former school governor, and I was very fascinated by the fact that a head teacher said to me that they really didn't think that homework was a great contributing factor to the success of a child. And parents will have a big debate over that, I'm sure. But Martin has a comment on homework. So Martin, if you would like to make your comment, and then our speakers will respond. Right, Martin has just said that he cannot answer live, so I'm going to read out what he has said. And what he said is, as long as education still relies on homework, the help of parents and extracurricular activities, there will always be structural inequalities in terms of access to further education. So would you like to start with that, Suzanne, briefly?
Yes, I would say it's an interesting view. And I think not only homework would increase the inequalities, but also the amount of tests that we are having. If we keep focusing only on results that are coming from tests, and if we are focusing on selection moments, then I think parents will be tempted, if they are able to do it, to provide children with more help from whatever institute possible, in order for them to finish that test in the best possible way. So I think I agree with you, Martin, and I think there is even more than homework if it comes to this issue.
Yes, please.
Can I add to this? I must actually say that I find homework a very important part of learning. We want students who are independent learners, who can study on their own, who can set their own goals, monitor their progress. And I do think homework can actually enable development of this kind of independent learning. Of course, if we give homework that, only parents can do, which is often the case, or if we give, homework that just, dumps work that the teacher hasn't finished on students and families, yeah, I think it will have a negative impact. But I do think this kind of independent learning is very, very important, and we wish that students would be better at that now in this moment of crisis.
Very, very well said, Andreas, and I'm sure a lot of teachers would agree with you there. Thomas?
I think I also agree with Andreas in the sense that homework is in a way the skill that pupils will also need when they go to university or in fact to any other job or simply want to educate themselves outside any clear educational path, even at the age of 30 or 40. Knowing how to do your homework might be helpful. But I also think we need to take into consideration what Suzanne was saying, that homework can exacerbate educational inequality. And we probably should also be very open and honest about what we mean when we say meritocracy, because in a way there is no equality of opportunity, and the end point in a way of parents is always the starting point for the children. So what education researchers use as their measure of sort of as their predictor for how successful a child is going to be at school. It's not even money, it's not ethnicity or religion, it's the number of books at home. And this is, in that sense, meritocracy is always a bit of a sham, and we need to ameliorate it, but we also need to be honest about the fact that it's not a fair race in that sense, but it should be as fair as possible.
Thank you, Thomas. Very well observed. We have another question from Annie. I haven't had an indication whether you'd be willing to speak. So Annie, would you like to ask your question? And the reason I've chosen Annie's question, just to give you a full warning, is that it's all about children with additional needs, and it's something I'm particularly passionate about.
So I'm hoping you can hear me now.
Can hear you now, Annie. Yes, please ask your question.
Lovely. Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. One of the best live sessions I've been following so far. I think it is more important than ever not to fail our learners. And we do have to map and address priorities, and clearly digital divide, vulnerable children are very high on the list. But what I asked was whether we should radically rethink how to ensure truly inclusive teaching solutions, and in particular how we cater for special needs like dyslexia and ADHD, making sure that the new virtual distance learning techniques actually proactively support different learning styles. I just think these are known issues. Children have been suffering for a long time under the classic teaching structures. And is there a way we can address these and cater for them better? What's fascinating about the online world is, in principle, there's more choice. We could regroup the kids differently. There's a huge amount of stuff that we could do if we saw this as an opportunity. And I have two kids with ADHD, one who's dyslexic. I wish we could be finding some exciting ways forward for them rather than making them feel as though things are getting more difficult in some ways. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question, Annie. It's so key to this discussion. So I'd like to start with Thomas, please.
Okay, yes, thank you. I think this is one of the key questions, because something that's being lost in the debate is we forget how complex the situation is and how different every child is. So there cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution, and it's especially in a time like this, people who rely on different learning strategies, different learning techniques or strategies, they need to be sort of considered as well. And in a way, I would like to answer this question by also picking up another one that's in the chat, and that is how should these software solutions be developed, and who should do it. And I think, in a way, it's really the task of the states or the different countries to say what we need. And one of the things that they should be very clear about is that there should be a standard for the dyslexic children or children with ADHD and so forth. ADHD, and that then we could have private companies or maybe even state-funded companies looking for software solutions that incorporate all these interests. But in a way, there should be clear standards that take into consideration not, so to speak, the standard child, which doesn't exist anyways, but every child. And then those solutions should be developed and funded accordingly, I would say.
Thank you. Andreas?
Yeah, I think this crisis somehow highlights one of the structural weaknesses of our current education systems, which are heavy, which are industrial, and which are always geared to the average, which doesn't exist. And in a way, it's technology at the moment also here amplifies those kinds of disparities. But I must say that there are some European countries actually that have shown us that it can be different. If you look to Estonia, if you look to Finland, they don't have 10 or 20% of students with special needs, but they have 100% of students with special needs. It's simply the demand on the teacher not only to know their subject and how different students learn that subject differently, but also to know their students. Actually, the schooling day offers many opportunities for teachers and to actually engage with students as individuals. They understand how their students learn differently, and they embrace that diversity with pedagogical practice. So actually, I think within Europe, we have some great examples for countries that are doing so much better when it comes to inclusion than others. And getting away from this average, getting away from labeling and stigmatizing students with different kind of disadvantages towards really personalizing learning consistently. I also think this is an use where technology offers huge promise. If you look at actually the power of big data and data analytics, actually we can now use technology to much better understand how students learn and basically give students individual and personalized and immediate feedback rather than just the check marks provided at the end of the school year. I do think there is a lot of promise. You can solve a math problem on a screen, and while you solve the problem, the computer will study you, how you learn best, what the kind of problems that you like and the problems that you dislike, and where you are very good at and where you need to become better. And I think if we can complement and combine the capacity of teachers on the relational aspects, on the social aspects, with the diagnostic capacity of technology, I think we could make a big, big difference to actually enable students with very different needs to succeed in school.
I couldn't agree with you more, Andreas. And some of the best teachers that I know are the ones who don't limit their teaching to the straightforward reading, writing, and doing it in the traditional way, and accepting that every child is different. We all, even as adults, we all learn in completely different ways. People are visual, some people are kinesthetic, etc. And I think if we made more of an effort or put more input into the idea of seeing children and adults as individuals in our teaching and our education systems, we wouldn't necessarily have to have this separate category for children who have what are viewed as additional needs, which is often viewed as a burdensome thing, when actually inclusivity should be across the board with specific input and investment in those children who need it most. So I am completely with you on that, Andreas. Suzanne?
Yes, I think a lot has been said about this topic, but I'd like to stress the importance of technology in decreasing inequalities. Similar to what Andreas said, I think, whether it's an online classroom or a physical classroom, technology can have a great role in order to decrease the inequalities, but also to see to the special needs that every student actually has. And then I'm thinking about educational robots, iPads that can be available for every student, and that can also, relieve the burden for some of the teachers who are coping with a lot of difficult issues in their classroom. So that is something that I would like to add.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. We've got time for maybe one or two more questions, I think. So I'm just wondering whether somebody called CI would like to ask their question. That's the only way that I can see your name. I don't see anything else. So would you like to ask your question? Just to forewarn the speakers, this question is about integrated education curricula. I'll assume that CI isn't available to speak, so I'll just read out their question. And what they've asked is whether we should consider the idea of an integrated education curriculum or major guidelines across Europe. What you think of that idea? Could be quite controversial, but Suzanne, would you like to answer that?
It's a big question with a lot of I think, yeah, of course, I think there are good things and bad things about it. Right now, I think you could say that there is a common ground in the curriculums for, well, all across Europe. Maybe you could start with some kind of a European citizenship and try to spread that all across Europe. But I think it's quite difficult at this moment to, to agree on all of the aspects of education. But I guess that Thomas and Andreas have a little bit more of a better side on this than I have.
Thomas and Andreas, what I'm proposing is, because I've got a couple of questions that I think I could ask directly to you, I might do that. But do you have a comment on this particular question, or shall I move on to the other two that I would like to address to you specifically?
Yeah, actually, there is a lot of discussion now, both at European and even global levels at the OECD about, how can we collaborate more effectively across borders to integrate curricula, and also to help students more to think out of the box, to understand different ways of thinking, different cultures, different. I think there is a lot of effort in this citizenship space. Integration is out at school. I think if we can do already better to help, teachers, the math and science and the history teacher and the philosophy teacher to work together, bring integrated curricula to help students think across the boundaries of disciplines. And innovation is no longer about you just being a specialist in one narrow area, but you being able to connect the dots for the next big ideas to come from. And I think to create more cross-curricular learning experiences at school can be a start. And then you can ask, how far do you want to extend that to the international space?
Great.
Very quickly to burn my tongue on this question. I think Europe can play, or the European Union can play a huge role when it comes to recognition and when it comes to enabling pupils to, take one or two parts of their educational path in different countries, not only, by the way, for universities, but also for schools and for apprenticeships. But when it comes to developing curricula and all these kinds of things, I'm a bit of a federalist. I think it's good to give regions and local communities the opportunity to develop their own concepts and then see what concepts work best. But that's a very long debate, and even within German liberalism, there are a few very different opinions. So I don't want to go too deep into that now.
Thank you for that. In fact, the person who asked the question, CI, had slipped away from the computer for 30 seconds just as I asked them to put their question. So if you're back, do you want to just comment briefly on what you've heard, CI?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much, actually.
You've got about 30 seconds.
Yeah, and I was laughing because I left for 30 seconds and now you took my question. So yeah, actually you're right. I was listening the last answer to my question, and yeah, I have to admit that leaving to community the possibility of developing their own, let's say, way of education is important too. But at the same time, I was thinking to this idea for the fact that I heard about changing the paradigm of what we should teach to our kids and the different level of education in different countries and regions or things like that. So I was thinking that maybe the idea will help to reach normal and decent level of education for everybody. So.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for summing that up. And you might not have had your 30 minutes of fame, but you've had 30 seconds of fame. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to address specifically, perhaps with Thomas, how this question is from Philip, who's unable to speak. And he's asked about how we can teach pupils the skills that are necessary for the digital age that is coming. My observation as a mother of 4 young children who are all able to figure out how to use Zoom far better than I can, is that it might actually be teachers who perhaps need upskilling in terms of digital skills for the coming age. But what are your views, Thomas?
I think life is in a way not an exam, so it's impossible for us to say, well, at the age of 30, you will be asked those 3 questions, so here you have to learn them. I mean, I think the skills that are probably needed is curiosity, the discipline, also a certain type of open-mindedness, and I'm stealing again a few terms that Andreas brought in because I think I like them and they are key. It's the ability to navigate ambiguity. It's going to be, there is no way for us to predict how the world is going to be in 10 or 20 years. I think they will be able to pick up the skills necessary if they keep an open mind and if they know how to work independently and if they are also able to question their own perspective. And they're, of course, this doesn't mean that we don't need hard skills. Mathematics and English and all the other languages will be important as well, and you can't replace them with deep learning and other tools. But it's also about, I think, also Latin and handwriting and history and art can teach us the skills we need for a digital age. And we should not focus simply on programming, although I do think that it's good for children to learn Python along the classics.
Andreas, can you answer that question as well as another question that's been asked by Francis of who is going to pay for all of this?
Yeah, I think this is a hard question. After the crisis, the health crisis, we will face a lot of financial difficulties. And we always prioritize the urgent over the important. I think education will have a hard time to defend its place, but our schools today will be our economy and our society tomorrow. So I do hope that you realize that these are important choices. This being said, I don't think this is all about more resources. I do think we should ask the question harder about how do we spend our resources best? How do we make the right trade-off between, paying teachers adequately and having, reasonable sized classrooms and giving teachers time for other things in teaching. So we should think harder about how to balance those different constraints. Education really hasn't looked at its work organization for the last 100 years. We have done things marginally better, but we need to start to think about how we reconfigure the spaces, the time, the people, and the technology so that we can actually achieve much, much better without necessarily spending a lot more. And I do think if I look within Europe, number 1 performer Estonia, both number 1 on the quality of education, on the PISA results, and number 1 on equity in education in terms of providing equitable opportunities. They spend less than 30% less than the European average on education. So I don't think this is all about just, spending more. I think we need to ask much harder questions about how do we, spend our resources best. The same is, by the way, true with the volume of learning time. People often think, if I want to do better, I have to add more time to learning. We have countries like Finland where students learn a lot with very little time, and other countries in Southern Europe where students spend a lot of time and learn relatively little. So I think actually, again, we should ask ourselves this kind of productivity question much more seriously, particularly after this crisis.
Thank you, Andreas. Suzanne, if there was one message that you wanted to convey as a closing comment, what would it be?
Well, first I'd like to add something about your question you just asked to Thomas and Andreas, because you mentioned something about, digitizing our teachers and making sure that they have the right qualities in order to give online education. I think we should really rethink the way that we are thinking about teaching, because teachers need some lifelong learning as well, especially during these days when we have a lot of innovative educational skills. I think it's very necessary that teachers go, for example, once in 2 years back to school or some kind of a course, and also have the space and the time in order to develop themselves during the week with other teachers, and online education is one of those skills. So that is one thing, and I think they need some time to do it. So that means that maybe we should shorten their work week. And they also need well, the right environment in order to learn those skills. So that is one thing. And yeah, the other thing, I think I would like to end where I started, and that was I spoke about inequalities of opportunities. And I said one thing about treating students differently. And I think we have to consider that, and we have to think about that more often. If you assume that not everyone has the same chances by birth, then you have to consider the option of treating children or people differently. If you assume that it matters where you come from, then you have to think about the investments that you do as a government in order for everyone to get those equality of opportunities. And that has a very big influence on education and on the way that you are organizing your educational programs. So think about that before you invest in education, and then consider, as Andreas was saying, how you are investing, but also, so how you're investing, not only what you're investing, but also how this is spent. Because I think we can do a lot with the investments that we already have. As Andreas was saying, Estonia is doing very well with few resources. I think we should learn from that.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I'm aware that we've run out of time. So what I will do is, before thanking everybody, just to give a plug for the next session that's coming up, to be confirmed on the 13th of May. So please take a look at the European Liberal Forum website and join the mailing list so that you can stay in touch with future webinars. This has been so incredibly educational for everybody participating. I've had loads of comments coming to me saying thank you to the speakers. So I will just end by saying merci, muchas gracias, danke, thank you very much to the European Liberal Forum for running this seminar, to the speakers, and to you, the participants, who have been absolutely fantastic, not only in the Q&A that you've sent to us in the chat, but also your very kind comments. So please also send us ideas of what you would like to see going forward into the future. So thank you very much, and we will sign off.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.